The phone call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March 2002. On the other end of the line, a trembling voice whispered words that would shatter the carefully constructed facade of one of America's most respected evangelical institutions. The caller was a former student, now in his 30s, finally finding the courage to speak about what had happened to him 20 years earlier in the dormitories of a prestigious Christian college. But here's what makes this story truly shocking. This wasn't the first call the administration had received. It wasn't even the 10th. For decades, a pattern had been quietly unfolding across evangelical America. Reports of abuse would surface, investigations would begin, and then silence. Not the comfortable silence of resolution, but the suffocating silence of institutional self-preservation. Victims found themselves facing not just their abusers, but entire religious communities that seemed more concerned with protecting reputations than protecting the vulnerable. The man on that Tuesday morning call had been just 14 when it happened. His abuser was a beloved youth pastor, a man who led mission trips, organized summer camps, and was considered a pillar of the community. When the boy had tried to tell his parents years earlier, he was met with disbelief. When he approached church leadership, he was told that making such accusations against a man of God required extreme caution and multiple witnesses, a biblical standard that conveniently almost never existed in cases of private abuse. What happened next follows a script that would be repeated hundreds, perhaps thousands of times across evangelical institutions over the following decades. The youth pastor was quietly transferred to another church in another state. No criminal charges were filed. No warning was given to his new congregation. The boy was counseled to forgive and forget, to trust in God's justice rather than man's, and above all to consider the damage such allegations might do to the ministry's ability to reach the lost. By morning, it was as if nothing had ever happened. But something had happened. And 2 decades later, that scared 14-year-old had become a man who refused to stay silent any longer. This pattern of institutional silence in the face of abuse allegations represents one of the most troubling chapters in modern evangelical history. To understand how we arrived at this point, we need to travel back to the foundations of evangelical culture itself to examine the theological and social structures that made such silence not just possible, but almost inevitable. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dive deep into the stories that shaped our world. I'm your host, and today we're examining one of the most difficult questions facing religious communities: how institutions meant to embody moral authority became complicit in protecting perpetrators while silencing victims. Before we continue, I'm curious. Where are you watching from today, and what time is it where you are? Are you a student, a professional, or perhaps someone with your own connection to religious communities? Drop a comment and let us know. Your perspectives help shape these conversations, and if you find value in the research and storytelling we do here, consider supporting the channel with a super thanks. Every contribution helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Now, let's journey back to understand how we got here. The roots of evangelical silence on abuse can be traced to several interconnected factors that emerged from the movement's theological and cultural DNA. First and foremost was the doctrine of authority, the belief that God works through established hierarchies, and that questioning those in positions of spiritual leadership was tantamount to questioning God himself. In many evangelical communities, pastors and church leaders weren't just administrators or teachers. They were seen as God's chosen vessels, men called and anointed for their positions. This created what scholars call a culture of deference, where challenging a leader's actions required extraordinary justification. When allegations of abuse surfaced, the immediate response wasn't to investigate, but to question whether such accusations could possibly be true about someone God had clearly blessed with spiritual authority. Consider the case of Jack Schaap, who served as pastor of First Baptist Church of Hammond, Indiana, one of the largest independent Baptist churches in America. For years, Schaap was celebrated as a dynamic preacher and church builder. His sermons were distributed nationally, his conferences drew thousands, and his influence within independent Baptist circles was immense. When rumors of inappropriate relationships with teenage girls began to surface in the early 2000s, they were largely dismissed by the church leadership and congregation. The few individuals who attempted to bring concerns forward found themselves labeled as troublemakers, gossips, or worse, tools of Satan attempting to destroy God's work. It wasn't until 2012, when concrete evidence finally became undeniable, that Schaap was removed from his position and eventually sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for transporting a minor across state lines for sexual purposes. But here's the devastating part of this story. Later investigations revealed that the warning signs had been there for over a decade. Multiple individuals had attempted to raise concerns only to be silenced, shunned, or driven from the church entirely. The institution's reflex to protect its leader had created an environment where predatory behavior could flourish unchecked. This pattern wasn't unique to Hammond. Across evangelical America, similar stories were playing out in churches large and small, in Christian schools and colleges, in mission organizations and youth camps. The details varied, but the institutional response remained remarkably consistent: deny, deflect, and protect the organization's reputation at all costs. The theological justification for this silence often came wrapped in biblical language. Church leaders would cite Matthew 18, which outlines a process for addressing conflicts within the church community. They would reference 1 Timothy 5:20, which calls for accusations against elders to be supported by multiple witnesses. They would invoke concepts of forgiveness, restoration, and the importance of not causing scandal that might damage the church's witness to the world. But these biblical principles, originally intended to promote justice and reconciliation, were being weaponized to silence victims and protect perpetrators. The requirement for multiple witnesses, reasonable in cases of disputed business dealings or personal conflicts, became an impossible standard when applied to crimes that by their very nature occur in secret. The call for forgiveness, meant to promote healing and restoration, became a tool to pressure victims into silence while allowing abusers to escape consequences. Perhaps nowhere was this dynamic more clearly visible than in the independent Baptist movement, where individual churches operated with minimal oversight and where pastoral authority was often absolute. In this environment, charismatic leaders could build personal fiefdoms, surrounded by followers who had been conditioned never to question their authority. Take the case of Tom White, who served as executive director of the Voice of the Martyrs, a prominent organization supporting persecuted Christians worldwide. White was a respected figure who had written books, spoken at conferences, and built a ministry with an annual budget of over $60 million. In 2012, allegations emerged that White had been sexually abusing children associated with the ministry for years. When these allegations first surfaced internally, the organization's initial response was to conduct a quiet investigation and attempt to handle the matter privately. White was allowed to resign for health reasons, and the full extent of the allegations wasn't revealed to supporters or the general public until much later. It was only when victims began speaking publicly that the true scope of the abuse became clear. The Voice of the Martyrs' handling of the White case followed a playbook that had become disturbingly common in evangelical circles. Minimize public exposure, protect the organization's reputation, and hope the problem would quietly disappear. The rationale was always the same. Protecting the ministry's ability to continue its work was more important than pursuing justice for individual victims. This institutional self-preservation instinct was reinforced by a peculiar aspect of evangelical culture: the belief that moral failures by leaders weren't just personal tragedies, but spiritual attacks that could undermine the entire ministry. In this worldview, publicly acknowledging abuse wasn't just admitting a crime had occurred. It was potentially giving Satan a victory by damaging the church's ability to reach the lost and serve the faithful. The prosperity gospel movement added another layer of complication to this dynamic. Leaders who preached that God's blessing was evidenced by success and growth found themselves in a particularly difficult position when faced with abuse allegations. Acknowledging such serious moral failures threatened the very foundation of their theology. How could God be blessing a ministry led by someone engaging in such evil behavior? This theological bind created powerful incentives for denial and cover-up. If success was evidence of God's favor, then allegations of abuse couldn't possibly be true. Or if they were true, they had to be minimized to preserve the appearance of divine blessing. The case of Robert Tilton, the televangelist whose Success in Life program reached millions in the 1980s and early 1990s, illustrates this dynamic perfectly. When allegations of financial fraud and sexual impropriety began to surface, Tilton's response wasn't to address the accusations directly, but to frame them as spiritual warfare. His supporters were told that Satan was attacking the ministry precisely because it was so effective. Questioning the allegations wasn't just disloyal, it was siding with the forces of darkness. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of evangelical silence on abuse was how it was often justified in the name of protecting the victims themselves. Church leaders would argue that pursuing criminal charges or public accountability would only cause more trauma for those who had already suffered enough. They would claim that the healing process required forgiveness and moving forward, not dwelling on past hurts through legal proceedings. This paternalistic approach robbed victims of their agency and their right to seek justice. It transformed the legitimate desire to protect victims from further harm into a justification for protecting perpetrators from consequences. Victims found themselves facing not only the trauma of abuse, but also the additional burden of being told that seeking justice was somehow unchristian or harmful to their own healing process. The story of Krista Brown, who was sexually abused by her youth minister at a Southern Baptist church in Texas, exemplifies the devastating impact of this approach. When Brown attempted to report the abuse to denominational leaders decades later, she was told that pursuing the matter would only cause her more pain. Church officials suggested that she focus on forgiveness and healing rather than seeking accountability. But Brown refused to accept this response. She began documenting and publicizing the Southern Baptist Convention's pattern of mishandling abuse cases, creating a database of accused ministers and demanding systemic reforms. Her advocacy work eventually contributed to significant changes in how the denomination addresses abuse allegations, but only after years of being dismissed, criticized, and marginalized by the very institution she was trying to reform. The independent fundamental Baptist movement presents perhaps the most extreme example of institutional silence on abuse. In this segment of evangelicalism, local church autonomy was taken to its logical extreme, with individual pastors wielding almost papal authority within their congregations. The movement's rejection of outside oversight, combined with its emphasis on unquestioning submission to pastoral authority, created perfect conditions for abuse to flourish unchecked. The case of Jack Hyles, who pastored First Baptist Church of Hammond before Jack Schaap, illustrates how this system could protect abusers for decades. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, allegations swirled around Hyles and his inner circle, including claims of financial impropriety, adultery, and the cover-up of abuse by associates. But Hyles' position within the independent Baptist movement was so secure, his authority so absolute, that these allegations never gained traction. Hyles had built a network of loyalty that extended far beyond his local church. He operated a college, ran pastor training programs, and had placed his protégés in churches across the country. This network functioned as both a pipeline for spreading his influence and a protective shield against accountability. Anyone who challenged Hyles found themselves ostracized not just from his church, but from an entire segment of the evangelical world. The tragedy of this system became clear only after Hyles' death in 2001, when more victims began to speak out and the full extent of the culture he had created became apparent. But by then, the damage had been done, not just to individual victims, but to the credibility of the entire movement. The megachurch phenomenon of the late 20th and early 21st centuries created new challenges for accountability in evangelical circles. These massive congregations, often built around charismatic personalities, generated enormous financial resources and political influence. The stakes for protecting these institutions became correspondingly higher. When allegations surfaced against leaders of prominent megachurches, the potential fallout extended far beyond the local congregation. Thousands of jobs, millions of dollars in revenue, and vast networks of affiliated ministries hung in the balance. This created powerful incentives for institutional self-preservation, even when the allegations were credible and serious. The case of Bill Hybels, longtime pastor of Willow Creek Community Church near Chicago, demonstrates how these dynamics played out in practice. Hybels had built one of the most influential churches in America, pioneering the seeker-sensitive movement that was copied by thousands of congregations worldwide. He was a best-selling author, conference speaker, and advisor to political leaders. When allegations of sexual misconduct began to surface in 2018, the initial response from Willow Creek's leadership was to rally around Hybels and dismiss the accusations as the work of disgruntled former employees and board members. The church hired an outside law firm to investigate, but structured the process in ways that many critics argued were designed to protect Hybels rather than uncover the truth. It was only when the allegations became public through investigative reporting by the Chicago Tribune that the full extent of the pattern became clear. Multiple women had come forward with similar stories spanning decades, describing a pattern of inappropriate behavior that the church leadership had either ignored or actively covered up. The Hybels case revealed how even churches that prided themselves on transparency and accountability could fall victim to the same institutional blind spots that had plagued evangelicalism for decades. The desire to protect the ministry's reputation and influence had once again taken precedence over justice for victims. But perhaps the most significant factor in evangelical silence on abuse was the movement's complex relationship with secular authority. Many evangelical leaders harbored deep suspicions about government involvement in religious affairs, viewing secular institutions as hostile to Christian values and beliefs. This suspicion created a strong preference for handling problems internally, within the church community, rather than involving outside authorities. When abuse allegations surfaced, the default response was often to seek biblical rather than legal solutions, to pursue church discipline rather than criminal justice, to emphasize forgiveness and restoration rather than punishment and accountability. This approach was often presented as being more faithful to Christian principles, but it had the practical effect of shielding abusers from the full consequences of their actions. Church discipline might result in removal from ministry, but it rarely led to criminal prosecution or civil liability. Abusers could often simply move to new communities and start over, their past hidden behind walls of institutional silence. The Catholic Church's abuse crisis, which became public knowledge in the early 2000s, initially served as a source of comfort for many evangelical leaders. Here was proof, they argued, of what happened when institutions prioritized hierarchy and tradition over biblical authority. Evangelicals, with their emphasis on individual relationships with God and biblical truth, would never fall victim to such systematic cover-ups. But this confidence proved tragically misplaced. As more evangelical abuse scandals came to light, it became clear that the problem wasn't unique to Catholicism. It was a broader institutional phenomenon that could affect any organization where power was concentrated and accountability was limited. The tragedy of evangelical silence on abuse extends far beyond the individual cases that have captured public attention. It represents a fundamental failure of institutions that claim to embody the highest moral standards, that presented themselves as sanctuaries of safety and truth in a broken world. For victims, this institutional failure compounded their trauma in ways that are difficult to overstate. They had been harmed not just by individual predators, but by entire communities that chose to protect their abusers. They discovered that institutions they had trusted, believed in, and devoted their lives to were more concerned with protecting their own reputations than seeking justice for the wounded. The psychological impact of this betrayal cannot be understated. Many victims found themselves not just dealing with the trauma of abuse, but also with the spiritual crisis of discovering that their faith communities were capable of such profound moral failure. Some lost their faith entirely. Others spent years seeking new spiritual homes where they could heal and rebuild their trust. The broader evangelical community has also paid a heavy price for these institutional failures. Public trust in religious institutions has declined dramatically over the past 2 decades, with abuse scandals serving as a major contributing factor. Younger generations in particular have become increasingly skeptical of organized religion, viewing it as hypocritical and untrustworthy. This crisis of credibility has forced some evangelical institutions to begin implementing meaningful reforms. Many denominations have developed new policies for reporting and investigating abuse allegations. Some have created independent oversight bodies with the authority to investigate churches and remove abusive leaders. Others have begun requiring background checks and training for all staff and volunteers who work with children and vulnerable populations. But these reforms have often come only after sustained pressure from victims' advocates, investigative journalists, and law enforcement agencies. The initial impulse toward silence and self-protection has proven remarkably persistent, suggesting that the cultural and theological factors that enabled abuse in the first place remain powerful forces within evangelical communities. The Southern Baptist Convention's recent reckoning with abuse provides a case study in both the persistence of these problems and the possibility of meaningful change. For decades, the convention maintained that its structure of autonomous local churches made it impossible to address abuse systematically. Individual churches were responsible for their own affairs, and the convention had no authority to intervene in local situations. This position conveniently absolved denominational leaders of responsibility, while providing no protection for victims who found themselves facing abusive pastors with no recourse beyond their local congregations. It wasn't until investigative reporting by the Houston Chronicle documented hundreds of cases of abuse within Southern Baptist churches that the convention was forced to confront the scope of the problem. Even then, the initial response was defensive and inadequate. It took years of sustained pressure from survivors and their advocates before the convention agreed to commission an independent investigation into how it had handled abuse cases. That investigation, conducted by Guidepost Solutions, revealed a pattern of resistance, denial, and cover-up at the highest levels of denominational leadership. The report documented how survivors who sought help from the convention were routinely dismissed, ignored, or blamed for their own victimization. It revealed how denominational leaders had maintained secret lists of accused ministers while publicly claiming they had no authority to track or address abuse cases. Most damaging of all, it showed how the convention's public statements about taking abuse seriously were contradicted by private communications that showed contempt for survivors and concern only for protecting the organization's reputation. The Guidepost report represented a watershed moment for the Southern Baptist Convention, forcing leaders to acknowledge the depth of their institutional failures and commit to meaningful reforms. But it also illustrated how difficult it can be to change deeply embedded cultural patterns, even when the moral imperative for change is clear and the costs of inaction are enormous. As we reflect on this dark chapter in evangelical history, several lessons emerge that extend far beyond religious communities. The first is the danger of unchecked authority in any institution. When leaders are insulated from accountability and criticism, when questioning their actions is treated as disloyalty or betrayal, the conditions are ripe for abuse and corruption. The second lesson is the importance of transparent processes for addressing allegations of misconduct. When institutions prioritize protecting their own reputations over seeking truth and justice, they inevitably fail both victims and the broader communities they claim to serve. Perhaps most importantly, this history demonstrates the courage required to speak truth to power, especially when that power is cloaked in moral and spiritual authority. The survivors who refused to stay silent, who insisted on accountability despite facing rejection and retaliation from their own communities, ultimately forced changes that have made countless others safer. Their stories remind us that silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality, it is complicity. That protecting institutions at the expense of individuals is not faithfulness, it is betrayal. And that true moral authority comes not from position or title, but from the courage to do what is right, even when it is costly. The evangelical community's reckoning with abuse is far from over. Many institutions continue to resist meaningful accountability measures. Many survivors continue to seek justice and healing. And many believers continue to struggle with how to reconcile their faith with the failures of the institutions that have claimed to represent it. But there are also signs of hope. A new generation of evangelical leaders has emerged, many of them survivors themselves, who are committed to building churches and ministries that prioritize transparency, accountability, and care for the vulnerable. Denominational structures are slowly evolving to provide better oversight and support for abuse prevention and response. Most importantly, the silence has been broken. What was once hidden in darkness has been brought into the light. And while the process of healing and reform will take time, the truth has a power that no institution can ultimately suppress. The phone call that began our story, that desperate voice in the darkness seeking justice after decades of silence, represents thousands of similar moments of courage across the evangelical world. Each person who chose to speak out, despite the personal cost, helped create the conditions for change. Their courage reminds us that no institution, regardless of how sacred it claims to be, is more important than the safety and dignity of the people it serves. As we close this difficult but necessary examination, remember that history is not just about understanding the past, it's about learning from it to build a better future. The story of evangelical silence on abuse is ultimately a story about the human capacity for both profound moral failure and remarkable courage. It reminds us that protecting the vulnerable requires constant vigilance, that power without accountability will always be abused, and that sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. Thank you for joining us on Professor Archive for this challenging exploration. If this content has provided valuable insights or helped you understand these complex issues, please consider supporting our work with a like, a subscription, or a super thanks. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and never stop seeking the truth.